大家好啊，今天是2024年11月27号。今天给大家分享这个辜朝明对中国最新救市政策的一些观点和分析吧。辜朝明，我不知道关注的小伙伴应该都了解吧？他是野村综合研究所的首席经济学家。他以什么出名呢？他提出了这个资产负债表这个衰退的这样的一个理论而著称啊。那这一理论呢，也被广泛用于解释啊。90年后日本经济和2007年后的西方经济的一些现象。他曾经担任纽约联邦储备银行的经济学家，也为多位日本首相提供经济和银行问题的这种政策和建议啊。好的，老规矩啊，我们也一起来看一下他对中国当下经济的这样一个分析。
Bring in Richard Koo, Chief Economist at Nomura Research Institute. And Richard, you're someone who's, well, you conceptualized and brought to life the concept of a balance sheet recession a few decades ago. But now you're talking about China's economy having all the hallmarks of a balance sheet recession. The stimulus measures that we've had since September, do you still see that being a possibility?
Yes. There were a lot of things announced in September and a whole series of them, but quite a few of them are actually, changing the bonds that were issued by the local financial platforms with the actual local government bonds and things like that, or central bank providing money so that companies can buy back their shares. Those are all basically changing the ownership of existing assets. And changing ownership of existing assets, no matter how large the amount is not counted toward GDP, if you remember. Well, to be counted toward GDP, it has to add something, value added to the economy. And when you look at from that angle, all these big numbers that came out are largely in the first category, that is to say, changing the ownership of existing assets. And only one of them really gets into the GDP stimulus way. And that is the package that was announced, I think, around October 16th, 17th, where the government said, we're going to put together 4 trillion renminbi package where developers who started a project but were not able to finish it because of liquidity and other problems, if that project is accepted in the white list that the government issued, then the developer can borrow money from this 4 trillion RMB package and finish the project. Now, according to the last report, they said about 2.3 trillion of that is already approved. But this one will definitely add to GDP because in order to finish the construction of these apartments, they need to get cement, the workers, and iron, the steel, whatever that's needed. So that's the one that will add to GDP. But the other ones that they have announced so far, they're just, of course, they're far better than nothing in a sense that they will clarify a lot of things and make people feel that the government is finally doing something about the situation. But in terms of really adding to GDP, that's the only package that so far that I can determine will actually add to GDP. And 2.3 trillion is the approved amount, but how much of that actually goes into the construction, we don't know. And still, this is far from enough, given the size of the Chinese economy and size of the balance sheet problems that they face. And balance sheet recession, takes a long time to get over. Japan took nearly 20 years. U.S. and Europe after 2008 also took 5 to 10 years. And this one the Chinese are facing, I'm afraid, could take just as long.
So Richard, I think part also of the premise you put forward in your thesis is it takes a long time to get over a balance sheet recession because it takes a long time to deleverage, particularly when you have rational actors like consumers who are acting logically, in fact, to delever their own balance sheets, for example. And I wonder whether a reflation in the property market accelerates that process, in your view. It's something that they're hopefully laying the foundations to achieve.
Well, we all like to see Chinese real estate market stabilize at some point, but they're facing many other problems on top of balance sheet recession. And that is that for people to really, get themselves to buy apartments, there has to be a narrative out there that says, okay, at this price, you won't go wrong. So you can go in and buy these apartments with borrowed money. And that's where the bottom of the real estate market will be. But given that, Chinese population is also shrinking, starting on the same year the bubble burst, these things, if you put these things together, that the bottom that people really feel safe to re-enter the market might be, far lower than under ordinary circumstances. I mean, Japan, a lot of people talk about demographics as a reason for stagnation. The Japanese population was still increasing from the bursting of the bubble 1990 all the way to 2009. So there was 19 years where the Japanese population was still increasing. So that issue of what is the right place, what is the right price to buy, was much easier because we could still argue that, well, population is increasing. Eventually, they need to live, find apartments to live. But in the Chinese case, the population is already decreasing on the same year that balance sheet recession happened. And so certainly government doing all sorts of things are helpful, but whether that will actually result in real bottoming out and recovery of the real estate market, I'm still quite doubtful.
Well, I guess beyond the property market, it's really about stimulating consumption and demand for debt across the board. And we don't see anything really coming through in loan demand, neither from corporates or households so far. But you're talking to the demographic challenges that's facing China's economy, and that is, of course, one of the key risks. Given that aging population, how long do you see this balance sheet recession extending? And can any of the efforts that China is making to address that in terms of trying to prop up the birth rate, invest into robotics, can any of that sort of avert the worst of it?
Well, in terms of the bubble itself, I think Chinese bubble is probably smaller than the Japanese bubble 30-some years ago. In the Japanese case, we had 500% increase in commercial real estate in just 5 years. And in the middle of Tokyo, the Imperial Palace Garden was said to be equivalent in value to the entire state of California. So you could imagine that the Japanese bubble was huge. So it took about 20 years to clean up the mess. Companies stopped paying down debt. In the Chinese case, I think as a percentage of GDP, bubble is probably smaller than the one Japan faced 30 years ago. And there's one other advantage that Chinese have over the Japanese is that a lot of people in China are already aware of this disease called balance sheet recession. So many people are talking about it in China. All of my English books were translated into Chinese. That's about 5 books. And so they know what the disease is. Whereas 30 years ago, those of us in Japan had no idea what we were going through. I mean, Bank of Japan brought rates down to 0, nothing happens, fiscal stimulus, no Keynesian pump priming. And so we said, oh, it must be structural, this and that. It was the balance sheet. And so we lost lots of time wondering what to do. In the Chinese case, most people know what the disease is. But the question is whether they have a will to put in this large fiscal stimulus. And one of the key difference between the Japanese and Chinese case is that Japan, the government was running budget surplus during the peak of the bubble. So going from surplus to deficit is not that difficult. But if you look at the Chinese flow funds, what the government budget deficit looks like, the central government budget deficit looks okay. But if you add local governments and look at so-called general government fiscal position, they were actually running deficit to the tune of 7% of GDP before the bubble bursting. And so the years before the bubble burst was actually supported by the Chinese government all along, especially starting around 2016 all the way to 2021. That period, the Chinese economy was actually supported by local government spending. And this is before the bubble burst. This is before the balance sheet recession. Now they're faced with balance sheet recession. They might need another, 4 or 5% GDP fiscal stimulus. But if you already start with 7, and if you add 5 on top of it, you're talking about 12% GDP deficit. And I think that's where people are still very hesitant to putting a large fiscal stimulus. I can understand that given the size of the numbers. But at the end of the day, I don't think they have much choice. Balance sheet recession, as you already mentioned, people are all doing right things, rational things. It's collectively, when they're all paying down debt at the same time, even at very low interest rates, someone has to borrow money and keep the economy going. And this part, only government can play this role because private sector sorts are all doing the right things, repairing balance sheets, rebuilding their financial health. And so at the end of the day, government has to do it. And there should be no financing problems in the balance sheet recession because balance sheet recession happens because private sector is saving too much. So the funds are already available in the financial system. And if government just come in and borrows it and spends it, then the economy should stabilize and start moving forward. But when you see very big numbers, people do get scared.
Yeah, and it seems to your point that a big number is needed, and ironically, debt might be the answer to the debt problem. So it brings to mind the role that the central government leverage profile comes to mind, and how much do you think the central government needs to lever up to address some of the and they're a top-rated issuer as well, and with rates this low, and I'm wondering what the prescription is. If you had to advise economic planners how much you have to lever up to solve the problem, what would that advice be, Richard?
Well, the Chinese flow funds data comes in very, very slowly, and so we really don't know how much excess savings the private sector is generating. And so I will start with any large number, let's say 4 or 5% of GDP. But if I were advising the Chinese government, I would say, we're going to do whatever it takes, as long as it takes. And this could be, very many years. But by coming up with something like that, and if that turns out to be too much, then you can always reduce this fiscal stimulus. But if it's too little, then the economy will be going through this deflationary cycle. And, at the end of the day, the medical cost of curing this patient will be so much more expensive. And actually, Chinese did that back in 2008. If you remember 2008, just after Lehman collapse, Chinese share prices were down 72% from the peak also. And I thought China may actually enter balance sheet recession as well, with 4 trillion renminbi package. And 4 trillion at that time was a big number. And with that, they were able to avoid balance sheet recession altogether. And they, when they announced this package and claimed that we're going to maintain 8% growth, the whole world was laughing. How could China, so dependent on export market, maintain 8% growth when the whole world is collapsing? Well, they had 12% growth just a year later. And then no one was laughing. People had a full trust in the government, and the economy did very well afterwards. But the problem at that time was that when they saw 12% growth, they should have reduced the fiscal stimulus. But because they felt so good about it, they kept it on, and then that caused all sorts of problems later. Too much bubble and corruption and whatnot.
Right.
What we need the Chinese to do now is something similar, but with the provision that if it proves to be too large, we'll cut it.
Richard, that seems to be a good jumping off point for our next conversation. That's all we have time for. Thank you so much for the time, Richard Koo.
看完他的分享啊，给我印象最深的一点就是，你要打破通缩，你要救市，你就要下猛药。像08年那样啊，经济危机的时候，你直接砸个4万亿啊，当时的4万亿占中国经济 GDP 的大概13%左右，你一下子把中国的经济从危机中解救出来。而现在呢，却像是挤牙膏一样啊，政策一点点的往外挤。看不到那种下猛药的这种力度啊，你就得要先下猛药，你起疗效之后，你再慢慢去减少剂量，不能说是先小剂量的，是疗效，不行的我再加一点，不行的我再加一点。当然啊，我们也不知道中央这么搞目的是啥？难道说你怕政策一下子打出去之后，当后续川普 重视上台之后，没有政策可出了吗？其实不论是美国还是中国啊，你想打败对方，你根本要做好的事情，你还是你国内的事情要搞好，你把国内的这一摊经济搞好了，国内稳住了，你等对方慢慢出错，然后才能在这场比拼中胜出，对吧？好，那今天的这个分享呢就到这里，谢谢大家。